Hello Internet, my name is Damian Michaels, but you can call me Blue, and welcome back to another episode of Brews. This week, we're playing our final companion in Historic Brawl with Keruga the Macrosage. Now this was by far and away the most difficult companion deck I've built up to this point. The restriction was tough, because unlike Lurrus, Keruga's opposite, you can't play non-permanents outside the restriction, so our earliest play is almost always going to be turn 3. This makes playing against pretty much everything a nightmare, because aggro already has you almost dead by this point. Control knows they can sit back and 1-for-1 you for several turns, so they can confidently tap down to deploy an early board that we can't answer, and mid-range combines both to a point it's hard to maintain a board presence and apply pressure. I tried several builds, including Amati Cascade, Yarok Panharmonicon, and Serac Big Dudes, but it all fell flat. The Yarok deck was kinda cool, but it felt a bit too much like the Satoru Garuda deck and the Sidisi Yumori deck, and I didn't want to build another version of the same deck again with a different restriction, so I kept looking, trying to find something fun and interesting to work with Keruga. Eventually, after lots of digging, I found two commanders that I felt would be pretty strong and unique from what I've already played: Thanos the Toymaker and Volo Guide to Monsters. Thanos felt very limited in what it could do, and I ended up not having enough birds or beasts to make it really functional, so I decided to play Volo Zoo with as many unique creature types as possible. There's a handful of doubles, but I did a pretty good job diversifying everything. The deck itself is pretty straightforward, and there's not really any combos other than drawing the entire deck and winning with Jace, Wielder of Mysteries. There's a Chroma's Memorial to build a massive board state and swing with everything all in one turn, but that doesn't happen often. I think I've pulled it off once, and I had to have multiple Nyx Bloom Ancients to get there, so that's a rarity. Otherwise, it's basically just grinding out the value to try and sneak out a victory. So we're just gonna jump straight into things here, but before we do, I do have an announcement later for an update regarding the future of this channel, so if you want to support me and see me grow, stay tuned until the end for some exciting news. Game 1! We're on the play against Gale, and we keep at 7. We start off with a forest and pass. For sure played the wrong land, but it's whatever. Opponent draws and begins with an island, followed by wizard class and passes. We untap, draw, and play a tapped Temple of Mystery. We scry an island to the top and pass. Opponent untaps, draws, and plays a mountain and a Tome of Gadwick before passing it back. We untap, draw, and play an island and put Keruga in hand before passing. Opponent untaps, draws, and plays a mountain, followed with a Tamackle Phoenix. They attack for 2 and pass. We untap, draw, and tank for a while before we play Kira Great Glass Spinner. We play the Kazandu Mammoth as a land and pass the turn. Opponent untaps, draws, and plays an island before equipping their tome to their Phoenix and attacking for 2. We don't block, so they get to draft a card. Second main, they level up Wizard class to Divination before they pass. We untap, draw, and play a forest, followed by casting Volo. We attack with Kira because we're not blocking with it anyway, and we pass the turn. Opponent untaps, draws, and plays an island and their commander, Gale. They move to combat and attack for 2, which we can't block, so they draft another card and pass the turn. We untap, draw, and play an island, followed up with a Kogla the Titan Ape. We trigger Volo, so we make a copy and have that copy fight Gale. Then the real one enters, and we keep that one to the legend rule. We have it fight their Phoenix before we attack for 5 and pass the turn. Opponent untaps, draws, and plays a mountain before going to combat. Their Phoenix triggers, and they pay 5 mana to get it back. They decide not to attack and just pass the turn. We untap, draw, and play the forest before moving to combat. We attack with Kogla, which lets us blow up their wizard class. They don't block, so they drop to 11. Post-combat, we play Tishana, Voice of Thunder. Volo copies it, and we get to draw 4 cards from each one entering. We keep the real one to the legend rule, and pass the turn with 12 cards in hand and multiple massive threats. Opponent untaps, draws, and plays a mountain, followed by their commander again. This isn't enough to stop the assault though, as they move to second main and scoop it up. Game 2. We're on the play and we keep at 7. We start with a Tangled Islet and pass the turn. Opponent draws and starts with a tap land before passing themselves. We untap, draw, and play an island followed by foretelling a Battle Mammoth and passing. Opponent untaps, draws, and plays a Plains with a Founding of the Thurn Path. They put it on Chapter 1 and cast a Faithful Mending from hand. They draw 2, discard 2, gain 2, and pass the turn. We untap, draw, and play a Verdant Catacombs. We crack it for an untapped breeding pool so we can cast Spring for a forest and pass the turn. Opponent untaps, draws, and Third Path triggers to mill themselves. They play a Botanical Sanctum and cast their commander before passing the turn. We untap, draw, and play the forest, followed by Monstrous Vortex before we pass the turn. Opponent untaps, draws, and their Third Path triggers again to exile their Silver Scrutiny from the graveyard. They cast it for 0 and play a green pathway. They go to combat and attack for 3 before passing the turn. We untap, draw, and play the Battle Mammoth we had on Foretell. This triggers our Vortex, so we cascade into a Kiora Behemoth Beckoner. It enters, then Mammoth resolves. Kiora triggers to draw a card, but they respond by using Giant Killer on our Mammoth. It triggers, so we draw another card. We play a forest and use Kiora to untap a land so we can put Keruga in hand and pass the turn. Opponent untaps, draws, and plays a Fabled Passage. They crack it to go grab a Plains and cast the Giant Killer. This triggers their commander so they can flashback the Fateful Absence to blow up Kiora. We investigate and they move to combat to attack for 3 before passing it back. We untap, draw, and play a Hidden Cataract tapped before we pass. Opponent untaps, draws, and moves straight to combat. They attack for 3 and move to second main to play a tapped Spara's Headquarters before passing. At the end step, we cast Mind to draw 2 cards. We untap, draw, and play an island so we can cast Volo and get some value. We cast Thunderous Snapper, triggering Volo for a second copy. Opponent responds by swordsing our Volo. We put it in the command zone, let the stack resolve, and pass the turn. Opponent untaps, draws, and plays an island before passing. We untap, draw, and foretell Alrund's Epiphany. Next, we play a tap land and cast Cultivate to go grab some basics. We put the forest into play, island to hand, and cast the Prowling Serpapard before we pass the turn. At the end step, opponent flashes back the Faithful Mending to draw 2, discard 2, and gain 2, before they tap a turtle with Giant Killer and go to their turn. Opponent untaps, draws, and plays a Wooded Foothills. They move to combat and attack for 3 with their commander. We block with the Token Turtle, and they got us here with a Wandering Emperor. They tick it up to give their dude a counter and first strike, allowing Lier to win combat and kill our turtle. After that, they just pass the turn. We untap, draw, and move to combat. We send everything at Emperor to get it off the board. They don't block, so she goes down, and second maze, we follow up with Volo for the second time. We play an island so we can cast Keruga uncounterably. Volo triggers, and we get a second copy to draw more cards. Vortex resolves, which hits an Imprison in the Moon. It doesn't work, however, as our opponent responds with Archmage's Charm to stop it. That's okay though, our real Keruga resolves, and we keep that one to the Legend Rule before we draw another large number of cards before we discard a bunch of lands and pass the turn. Opponent forgot to crack their fetch, so they do it on upkeep to go grab a Hedge Maze. They surveil Jwari Disruption to the bin and draw. They play a Pathway on white and pass the turn. We untap, draw, and play the Reliquary Tower, followed by Clever Impersonator. Volo triggers, and we have the token copy enter as Keruga so we can draw some more cards. We keep the real one to the legend rule and let the other impersonator hit the vortex for an explosive next turn. Next, we play the Alwyn's Epiphany, but it seems that that's the straw that broke the camel's back as our opponent scoops it up. Game 3, we're on the play against Skittles, and we keep at 7. We start off with a tapped Weird before we pass the turn. Opponent draws and plays a Swamp, followed by a greedy Freebooter before passing. We untap, draw, and play an Island before we pass it back. Opponent untaps, draws, and plays a Swamp, followed by a Deep Miner to grab a land. They attack for 1 and pass the turn. We untap, draw, and play an Island, followed up with Chromatic Lantern before passing. Opponent untaps, draws, and plays a Swamp with a Hired Poisoner before they pass. We untap, draw, and play a Solemn Simulacrum to go grab a Forest. Next, we play a Wooded Foothills and pass it back. Opponent untaps, draws, and plays a Swamp and a Grave Path. They attack with Freebooter for 1, and we crack our Footbills in response to go grab Hedge Maze. We surveil it to the graveyard and take the 1 before they pass the turn. We untap, draw, and play an Island, followed by a Settle the Wilds. We seek out an Island and grab a Junkwinder. Next, we play Vortex and pass the turn with no attacks. Opponent untaps, draws, and plays a Swamp with a Palantir of Orthanc before going to combat and attacking with the Freebooter. They move to end and scry 2 to the top. We choose to mill, of course, and pass the turn. We untap, draw, and play another Island, followed by Volo. We then cast a Spark Double to copy Volo, but Volo copies the Spark Double, so we end up with 3 copies of Volo by the end before we pass the turn. Opponent untaps, draws, and plays a Swamp before moving to combat. They attack with everything, and we take it all before they move to end. They scry 2 to the top, and we mill them both, going down to 9 in the process before they pass. We untap, draw, and play a Castle Garenbrig, followed by a Junkwinder. Volo triggers 3 times, and Vortex triggers once. So Junkwinder only cares when any token enters, including itself if it is a token. So we get to freeze basically their entire board from all of these Junkwinders. Vortex finally resolves, and we hit a Raven form from it, so we can exile their Palantir and turn it into a bird. Finally, the real Junkwinder resolves, and we move to combat. We attack with everything, and they block a Volo with the bird token. Grave Path makes us sacrifice a creature, so we get rid of this sad bot to draw a card and put Keruga in hand before we pass the turn. Opponent sorta untaps, draws, and plays their commander, Skittles. They give it haste and attack with 4 for Infect, but alas, it's not enough, and they scoop it up. I'm gonna be honest, this deck was certainly a challenge. I don't think any other companion gave me as much trouble as this one did. I lost a ton with this deck. I've said in the past, I try to present actually playable decks to you guys, but this was the best I was going to get out of Keruga. It was fun to play when it did manage to go off, but most of the time it was just too slow. Many of my losses were simply to getting beaten down before I could establish a board, like the game against Raccoons playing in the background. Usually I heavily edit the games I lose because I just don't like featuring the deck performing poorly, but this game against Raccoons has the dead air cut out and I sped it up, and that's it. The original clip was 3 minutes long before editing, so you can get a grasp of how so many of these games went. I had a game against Lifegain where I imprisoned their commander in the moon, and they still amassed an unbeatable board of tokens. and another game against Teamer Loot where the value train left the station and I didn't get my boarding pass. I couldn't find a River's Rebuke or anything, and we were dead on board after they cast their own that we knew they had in hand, so there was no point in playing that out. Overall, the deck was fun to play when it did its thing, but it leaves much to be desired, and I probably won't play this much again outside of this video. All the other decks I do still play on occasion, but this one will either get taken apart to make room for another deck, or I'll keep it together as a stark reminder of what not to build in the future. With all of that out of the way, I mentioned earlier that I have an announcement to make, and I'm excited to tell you guys that I made a Patreon. That said, I'm not going to sit here and beg for your money. In fact, I'm going to do the opposite. I don't think I deserve your money, and I'm not going to pretend like I do. I have just over 100 subscribers, and I'm still learning a lot as I continue on this journey of making content. But I wanted to make it so it was there when I was ready to use it. If you want to support me, feel free to like the video, subscribe, and share it with your friends. That will greatly help me grow, and they're completely free. But if you have a hankering to give, then my Patreon will be linked in the description. As of this video, there's only one tier, and it's $1 a month. Eventually, when I feel I've earned the trust of my viewers and I have more to contribute to add more tiers, then I will. But for now, liking this video and sending it to a buddy would be more than enough to let me know that I'm making a mark in the Magic community. That said, I'm going to go ahead and end things here. No point in going through my normal credits after the Patreon plug, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next week.